We are on a UX quest to become better storytellers, and I have a Captain Obvious alert for you here. If no one listens to your story, it's not going to make an impact. So how do we capture people's attention? One way to grab people's attention is to ask a rather open-ended question and then gradually share the answer. The trick, by the way, is to never let the audience know when you'll be finishing the answer. But of course, I would never do that to you. Why is winking so hard? Anyway. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my storytelling series. I'm Noam, in case you don't know me, and this is UX Quests. If you visited my channel before and watched other videos, welcome back. And if you haven't, this channel is called UX Quests because I hope to bring you on these quests with me. If you're interested in UX related topics, in crafting delightful user experiences, then this is the place for you, whether you're a researcher, designer, content strategist, founder, entrepreneur, or anyone else. In the previous scene, we discussed one of the, if not the oldest recorded stories in the history of humanity, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then we tied that to one of the most well-known frameworks for storytelling, the hero's journey. This time around, we're going to explore a basic fact. The human brain has evolved into a storytelling machine, a story generating machine, a story consuming machine. That's something that the brain does incredibly well, and for good reason, which we'll talk about a bit later. And when is this storytelling machine operating at full power? Well, at night, of course. Whether you remember it or not, your brain is taking you to a bunch of alternate universes of its creation every night. And bonus fact, this isn't only happening in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, it's happening all throughout the night. It's the research on dreams that has really shown us that the brain is a screenwriting machine. No, forget screenwriting, it's a full production crew. Your brain, our brains, are capable of taking us on infinite adventures every night, crafting a bunch of sometimes kind of crazy narratives. It's bonkers. But anyway, if we want to create incredible stories, whether they are research-related stories or whether you're trying to tell your own story in a job interview, we need to understand the inner workings of the brain, your primary storytelling machine. So today, we're gonna talk about 3 points because for some weird OCD reason, I cannot think of anything if it's not in threes. Number 1. How do you pull your audience in and grab their attention? Number 2, how do you decide what to include or exclude from your story? And number 3, where does your audience's journey begin? And where does your protagonist's journey begin in the story? Now, a moment of honesty here before we get started. I am not a world-renowned storytelling expert. I am going on this quest and I hope you join me. But I want you to know that there are so many other people to learn from, so many resources. I will try to share some of them below. Honestly, it's a bit anxiety-provoking to do this. I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you enjoy the other videos as well. But it's important to acknowledge your limitations. And I want you to know that I am on this quest with you. And I am trying to become a better storyteller myself. So I hope you continue to join me on this journey. It was love at first sight. The first time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. Yossarian was in the hospital with a pain in his liver that fell just short of being jaundice. The doctors were puzzled by the fact that it wasn't quite jaundice. If it became jaundice, they could treat it. If it didn't become jaundice and went away, they could discharge him. But this just being short of jaundice all the time confused them. This is the opening paragraph to my favorite book of all time, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. In case you haven't read it, a Catch-22 is a paradoxical situation from which an individual cannot escape because of contradictory rules or limitations. Now, in the book, there is like the catch-22, so I'll just read you that quickly. A mysterious Army Air Forces regulation which asserts that a man is considered insane if he willingly continues to fly dangerous combat missions, but that if he makes the necessary formal request to be relieved of such missions, the very act of making the request proves that he is sane and therefore ineligible to be relieved. The protagonist in this story, Yossarian, is desperately trying to stay alive and just be okay in the midst of World War II. And this story really showcases all of the absurdities and insanity of military service. Now, I think the beginning to that story, that first paragraph I read you, it's pretty damn perfect. Why? Well, you can watch me right now because I'm staring at a camera, which is recording immense amounts of information onto memory cards, which I can then, download onto my computer and share with all of you. Yet, as much as I'm recording on this camera in gorgeous 4K, it pales in comparison to the amount of information your brain is processing and recording every single second. Your brain is by default constantly overwhelmed, but it is also incredibly sophisticated. So to get past being overwhelmed, the brain tends to focus on stories, on narratives. In a sense, it's almost like your brain is running around a jungle of information with a machete in search of meaning, in search of significance. With Catch-22, Joseph Heller is giving our brains exactly what they crave for from the very first paragraph: a reason to care. You've got a weird and wonderful hero, a mysterious love story, a paradoxical medical conundrum. As readers, we just kind of immediately know just enough to figure out who this is about and what they're going through and what conflicts they're facing on their path to surviving the war. And it's those conflicts, those battles, trying to overcome obstacles on the way to a goal, that's what gets our brains curious. And curiosity is a dopamine engine, and dopamine feels good. We have evolved to be curious because curiosity is what makes us survive. Or, it used to matter when you were in a cave, and if you weren't curious enough about your surroundings, you could be eaten by a lion or something. I guess that's less relevant right now, but you get the point. Curiosity is still useful. By the way, you know what doesn't make me curious? Executive summaries. Executive summaries are a typical example of trying to be more agile, leaner, more scrappy, get through things faster, and then it completely fails. You know what else doesn't get me particularly curious? Job candidates who share fairly random things from their resume, which I have reviewed before they come in, or personal tidbits about, a hobby or something. I want to know why you are in the interview. I want to know why I should care. I want to know why you care as an interviewee. I want you to take me on a journey with you, just like I'm kind of trying to do right now. To vividly feel the conflicts you've been through and the consequences of the decisions you've made so far in your career. So regardless of whether you're crafting a presentation for a work meeting, or you're about to have an on-site, or whatever on-sites are called these days now that they're not literally on-site, you have to get your audience to crave more from the very first second that you introduce your narrative, your story. You need to hurtle them into the action from the very first sentence, from the very first paragraph, and then never relent. So let's recap here for a second in case I wasn't clear. How do you pull your audience in and capture their attention? You hurtle them straight into a microcosmos of your broader narrative. You get your audience's curiosity high, you get that dopamine pumping, you introduce some inklings of the conflicts they're about to see, the journey the protagonist is about to be on, whether that protagonist is you or your users. That's how you get started. By the way, this video, just like all of the other videos coming up in this series, was inspired by a bunch of books and resources I've been reading recently and also far in the past, and I've linked everything in the description below just so you have access to what you need. Also, in case you've forgotten, I love to get comments and questions, and I'd love to hear about additional topics you'd like to hear about or whatever. So please comment below with anything. So how do you decide what to include in your story, whether it's, again, a research presentation or your interview presentation or whatever it is? You may think, for example, that if you're crafting a research presentation, your insights are the focus of the narrative. They're not. You see, any story is about, first and foremost, the big question. It might be the question you set out to answer, say, in your research plan. It might be something else, but it is that big question, whatever that means to you, that is the foundation of the story. Once we recognize this, then you can decide what to include or exclude from your story based on asking yourself this: does this piece of information help people get closer to resolving the question, the big question? Does this piece of information, this piece of the narrative, move the audience closer to the resolution they crave for? Sticking with the example of a research-related presentation for now, consider this. If the audience doesn't deeply understand who you're talking about, who the user is, they'll never be able to empathize with them. If you don't share these users' goals, their aspirations, what they're trying to accomplish, the audience won't comprehend the stages and the key moments in the user's journey. If you don't discuss the barriers and the obstacles that your users are facing, if the audience doesn't feel their pain, really feel their pain, the impact of your work, it'll be lost on your audience. So in a way, you kind of need to reverse engineer your story to figure out what should make the cut. If you focus your narrative on the big question, this is what should be happening in your audience's brains as they let it sink in. First, as you begin to introduce your question, the audience's neurons are already firing up as their brains begin to explore all of their existing knowledge about this question, what they feel like they do know already, what they don't know. What do they understand when it comes to this question, and what is left to explore for them? Unlike the dopamine that was released in your audience's brains right from the get-go, now it's actually serotonin that's being released. Serotonin helps us explore issues and ponder. It helps expand the number of networks we're utilizing in our brain as we explore a problem space. In turn, as your audience is slowly starting to reach their own insights, their brains are being flooded with serotonin. You can all just vividly see the solutions to the big question you posed at the beginning of your narrative. And the good news is then your audience will be ready to act upon these insights. So essentially, you need to be asking yourself, not surprisingly, 3 things at all times. Number 1, what's the point of this story? And given what you want people to walk away with, to walk away thinking about, how does this puzzle piece fit the broader narrative? Second of all, what does the audience already know about the user or about you if it's a job interview? And what does this particular puzzle piece within the narrative add to their knowledge of the protagonist, so to speak? And then finally, as you consider a piece of information and whether to include it in your narrative or not, think to yourself, would this particular puzzle piece make it into a short summary of your story or not? If you don't think it would, maybe it's worth leaving out. So quick recap here. What drives your audience to action is when they are seeking resolution for the big question, so to speak. So always focus on the question. And be thinking to yourself, does this particular puzzle piece fit into the narrative? Does it relate to this question? Does it help us move forward in our exploration to finding the insights that we all need to find? But for this video, that still leaves us with one open question, which is, where does the journey really begin? I'm a Shakespeare fan, and in particular, I love Hamlet. Hamlet is certainly one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. It's also arguably one of the most influential literature pieces in the history of humankind. In case you haven't read it or seen it performed, Hamlet is set in Denmark, and it depicts Prince Hamlet and his revenge against his uncle Claudius, because Claudius murdered Hamlet's father using poison, and then he seizes his throne and marries Hamlet's mother. Not great. Anyway, what's interesting about Hamlet and relevant to us is that Hamlet was a departure from Aristotle's thoughts on drama writing. Specifically, Aristotle had strong views on tragedy, which Hamlet is, by the way, and how it's action-driven rather than character-driven. Quoting Aristotle here for a second, tragedy is a representation of a serious, complete action which has magnitude in embellished speech, with each of its elements used separately in the various parts of the play, and represented by people acting and not by narration, accomplishing by means of pity and terror the catharsis of such emotions. Now, Shakespeare decided to go against this kind of common dramatic structure at the time, several hundred years ago, such that it was through soliloquies and not the action that the audience learned about Hamlet's motives and thoughts. In the user research realm, especially the qualitative one, we tend to do the same thing. In other words, yes, we care about behaviors, but we recognize that the what people do is just a small part of understanding them. It's a small part of the entire picture. Honestly, it's also why I love the title of user researcher compared to other titles we can get in our profession: design researcher, product researcher, etc. User researcher just seems to put the focus on the people we're trying to understand rather than our background or which team we report into. So where does the journey begin? Here's the thing, y'all. We all have an agenda. We are all directed by goals. And we have evolved such that our number one goal is to understand everyone else's goals. That's where the journey begins. That's where your story starts. Hamlet's goal, for example, is revenge against his uncle Claudius for murdering his father with poison. For your research story, the journey should start with the user's goals and the obstacles they have to face to achieve that goal. If it's your career story, you want to start with your career goals and why you're trying to achieve them and the obstacles you've encountered on your career path. Without that goal, without that quest in mind, you are starving the audience's brains from what they are craving for, because our brains desire order, purpose, meaning through goals. That's how we think. So just to recap this point, we are goal-oriented creatures, and we have evolved such that our number one goal is to understand everyone else's goals. That's why sharing your user's goals and the obstacles on the way to achieving them, or your own goals if you're in a career interview, in a job interview, that's the ideal way to start your narrative. As always, let me know if this video was helpful to you, interesting. We will be jumping a lot deeper into both research narratives and career narratives, but for now we're just focusing on some of the foundations that help us tell better stories and help us understand how the mind works, how people think about stories, and some of the broader tips on how to create and craft incredible stories. So I'd love you to follow along. I'm also on all the social medias, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok even. Probably gonna make a TikTok video tomorrow. So I hope you follow along. I hope you subscribe to the channel for many more videos to come about storytelling and other interesting topics. Thanks for sticking around on this particular UX quest, and I will see you next time.